Hi, my name is Neil Jennings. I work at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College London. Sorry that the London Climate Change Festival hasn't been able to go ahead in person for obvious reasons, but really delighted to be able to contribute to the festival remotely via this recording. So, as I said, my name is Neil. I work at the Grantham Institute, which is a climate change research centre at Imperial College London. And the presentation I'll be talking about for the next 25 minutes is all around how action on climate change can help us to simultaneously tackle other key societal challenges. So a very brief bit about the Grantham Institute. So we're a hub of climate change and environment related research at Imperial College, and our vision is to try and help to create a sustainable, resilient and zero carbon society. And we do this through a variety of different mechanisms. We train up PhD students and our staff. We develop innovations that we take outside of the academic community into the real world. As you'd imagine, as a university, we conduct research, and the last two actions here, inform and connect, is where my role really comes in. I help to communicate the research from our scientists at Imperial into more easily understandable formats. So over the next 20 or 25 minutes, I'll cover the following. I'll talk about the urgent need for action on climate change. I'll talk about the co-benefits of climate action for the UK, so how action on climate change can help us to achieve other key aims, and then talk about, very briefly, the things that we can do in our day-to-day lives that make a difference. So many of you will have seen graphs similar to this before. So this is data from the UK Met Office, and in the middle you've got the years going from 1850 through to the present day, and what the y-axis shows is the temperature change compared to pre-industrial levels, so before around 1850. It shows the change in temperature over time. And so what you can see is that we've increased global temperatures by approximately 1 degree Celsius in the last 170 or so years. And the colours scheme behind the graph is something called climate stripes. So this is put together by a researcher from University of Reading, and what this shows you is each line going down is a year, and this shows you the temperatures. I think in this case from the UK going back over 170 or so years. So what you have is the darker blue colours are the colder years, and the darker red colours are the warmer years. And what this does is obviously kind of mirrors the graph in the middle in terms of showing this change in temperature over time, and does so in quite an effective way in communicating that temperature change. So we've increased global temperatures by around 1 degree Celsius over the last 170 years. So I think I'll set out now some of those kind of key temperatures that often get spoken about in terms of climate change. So on the kind of image on the left-hand side here, before pre-industrial levels, we're taking that as being the bottom of this line. So we've now increased global temperatures by 1 degree Celsius. So back in 2015, all the countries of the world came together in Paris to sign what became known as the Paris Agreement. So this set out the aim to keep global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius in comparison to that pre-industrial temperature, and to pursue efforts to limit the increase even further to try and keep below a 1.5 degree rise of global temperatures above pre-industrial levels. And I'll elaborate in the next slides why these thresholds, why these are important, and why every fraction of a degree matters. One thing that also happened in Paris and since Paris is that each country of the world has been asked to come up with what's called a nationally determined contribution. So it's basically the country laying out what their expected emissions of greenhouse gases are in the next period of time. And all of these commitments by these different countries, these NDCs, are all added up. And the key thing at the moment is that we're on course by the end of this century for a 3.1 degree, roughly 3.1 degree rise in global temperatures on the basis of the current commitments that individual countries have made. So it's really important over the next, indeed this year, depending on what happens in terms of the conference that's due to take place in Glasgow, the climate conference in Glasgow. It's really important that countries of the world are increasing their ambition within their NDCs in order to bring down this temperature that we will hit by the end of this century on the current trajectory that we're going on. Okay, so here's a few of the key temperatures, and I'll elaborate a bit now on what's this difference between what's included in the Paris Agreement. What's 1.5 degree world look like compared to what a 2 degree world looks like. So in October 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a report on 1.5 degrees. So this was for the first time, really laid out the difference between what a 1.5 degree world looks like as compared to a 2 degree world in comparison to temperatures before the Industrial Revolution. The key conclusion they came to was that every fraction of a degree matters in terms of the impact that we have upon our natural environment and also upon society. But the take-home message was also that we still have time to limit warming to a 1.5 degree rise above pre-industrial levels. Then just to give an indication about what these things mean between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So in the natural world, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, looked at the difference that those different temperature thresholds would have upon warm water coral reef. And what they found in a 2 degree world, so only 1 degree more than now, all warm water corals are gone, unlikely to recover within human lifetimes. Things are still pretty bad if we hit that 1.5 degree threshold. At that level, only around 10 to 30% of warm water coral reefs are gone. They will look like the image depicts here. They'll be bleached, and life will look very different for coral reefs and the species that inhabit them. So to pull out a few other comparisons between 1.5 and 2 degrees, so the IPCC looked at the proportion of the global population that would be exposed to an extreme heat event at least once every 5 years. In a 1.5 degree future, that figure that would be exposed to extreme heat once every 5 years was around 14% of the global population. In a 2 degree future, over a third of the global population, 37% of global population, would be exposed to an extreme heat event once every 5 years. If we look to the Arctic, in a 1.5 degree future, the Arctic would be free from ice in summer at least once every 100 years in a 1.5 degree world, but once in every 10 years in a 2 degree world. And if we look at loss of plant species around the world, so this is defined as being the percentage of plants that lose at least half of their habitable area. So in a 1.5 degree future, 8% of plants globally would lose at least half of their habitable area. In a 2 degree future, that rises to 16% of all plant species. And so one of the conclusions for the as probably illustrated there, is there's significant differences between a 1.5 and a 2 degree future. And what the IPCC also concluded was that there's hundreds of millions of people additionally who will be exposed to climate related risks and at greater level of susceptibility to poverty between that 1.5 and 2 degree threshold. And so that report was put together at the global scale and has since been analysed and reinterpreted by organisations in individual nations to try and understand better what those thresholds mean for their particular country. So in the UK, the Met Office did a piece of analysis to try and look at this in more detail. And you may remember the summer of 2018, which was a record equalling summer in terms of how hot it was at the time, a really long heat wave. So if we look at the likelihood of that summer occurring, if we go to a 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures, that summer will occur once in every 4 years. If we go to a 2 degree rise in global temperatures, that summer will occur every other year. And as you can imagine, that was an extreme summer at the time, so the extremes will become even more extreme, even hotter, with the associated disruption that has upon society, upon increased rates of mortality, upon our transport infrastructure as depicted here, which is not well adapted to those higher temperatures. Okay, so that's the kind of bad news in terms of the potential impacts that climate change will have in these different thresholds. What the IPCC also did was to look at the trajectories that we need to go down to avoid these global temperature rises. So this graph here, on the x-axis, you've got the date going from 2010 to 2100, and on the y-axis, you've got global emissions of carbon dioxide. So at the moment, each year we emit across the whole of the world around 40 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded, this graph, the lines here is showing the trajectory that we need to go down in terms of our emissions of carbon dioxide while still remaining underneath this 1.5 degree temperature threshold. If we are to avoid this 1.5 degree temperature threshold, two key things need to happen. We need to decarbonise, we need to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases steeply, approximately halving them by 2030, and we need to get to a point of net zero by around 2050. So hopefully the information so far has conveyed the fact that there is a very rapid path that we need to go down to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and lots of organisations like Extinction Rebellion are calling for this rapid change in our emissions of greenhouse gases. But one thing we also need to be aware of is what's depicted on the right hand side here. So this is a photo from Paris, from the Gilets Jaunes, so individuals protesting against a climate related tax, a carbon a tax on fuel associated with the impact that it has upon the environment and on greenhouse gas emissions. So how do we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in a way which is consistent with avoiding the worst consequences of climate change and is helping to meet the demands of those on the left, while ensuring that we take the public with us and avoid scenes as depicted on the right hand side here with the Gilets Jaunes? Well, for me, a key thing that we need to do is we need to talk about climate change and act on climate change in a way which brings in other people's key priorities. So what this graph is data from Ipsos Mori, the polling organisation in the UK, and they ask a question once a month of the public, which is an open-ended question, and they ask a representative sample, and the question is, what issue are you most concerned about? And people can say more than one thing, and then they're categorised into these different categories. So you can see if some of these, the way things have changed over time. So this data shows the level of concern of different issues from 2007 to the present day. And on the y-axis, you've got the percentage of responses of those particular issues that were being brought up by members of the public. So the green line you can see is the economy. So high levels of concern following the economic crash of 2008. You can see a few other things coming. So the orange line is the NHS and healthcare. So you can see that over the last 2 or 3 years, this has been either the most or the second most important issue of concern amongst the public, and is typically tracked relatively high. The grey line you can see is people concerned by the EU, which suggests that actually people weren't concerned about the situation with the EU until the referendum was forced on us. And then it went on to be the single biggest issue of concern amongst the UK population. The one thing I'd really like to draw out is the dotted line. So the dotted line is people who are concerned by pollution and the environment. And there's two things here. So when I first started working on this and looking at this data, my key take-home message was that for most of the period, less than 10% of the population stated that they were concerned by pollution or the environment, and therefore that we need to talk about climate change in relation to these other issues that are shown in the graph above it. So talk about climate change in relation to the NHS, in relation to housing, for example. But the thing that's happened over the last couple of years has led me to change that key message slightly, in that this, you can see that the dotted line has tracked steadily upwards over the last 2 years, to the point now with the most recent data for an individual month, that pollution of the environment was the third most important issue amongst the UK public. There's now a much clearer mandate for decision makers to take action on climate change purely on the basis of public interest and public concern with this issue. Having said that, it's still really sensible and prudent for us to look at the ways that climate change links to these other key strategic issues, because we can help to get more action on climate change by bringing in the relationship that climate action has to other things like health and housing and the economy and so on. So here's a quote from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change talking about co-benefits and what co-benefits mean. So they suggest that co-benefits are the positive or negative effects that a policy or measure aimed at one objective can have upon another objective. And they suggest while these are often referred to or argued with, they're often or less often quantified or monetized or incorporated into the decision-making process. So there's an opportunity for us to do better in capturing the co-benefits that climate action has in order to ensure that they are incorporated into the decision-making process, so we can get more action on climate change while getting other action on other issues simultaneously. So what I did with some colleagues was to go through the academic literature to look at where there were synergies between action on climate change and other key strategic priorities or key issues of concern from the UK public, as shown in the graph 2 slides ago. And what we did was we grouped these co-benefits into 4 different areas: into health and the NHS, to immigration and security, to the economy and unemployment, and to poverty, housing and inequality. The full version of this briefing paper is available on our website. The URL is at the bottom there. And what I'll do now is just to go through a couple of specific examples of how these co-benefits act and play out in the real world. So to firstly focus on health and housing and how climate action fits in. So in the UK, we have a situation where over 10,000 excess winter deaths take place each winter due to the poor quality of housing, which is frankly a shameful statistic given that we are the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world. So Age UK estimate that the poor quality of housing in the UK costs the NHS around £2.5 billion a year. And the Healthy Homes Barometer suggests that there's around 27 million lost working days a year due to poor housing in the UK, and that costs the UK economy around £1.8 billion a year from people missing work through being ill and also going to work in an unhealthy state of health due to the poor quality of their housing. And the housing situation at the moment, and poor quality housing has both physical and mental impacts upon people's well-being and their health. So this hexagon will show a kind of example about how this issue trades off with different parts of society. So in the UK at the moment, we're in a situation where if you live in poverty, you're disproportionately likely to live in a house that has a lower energy performance certificate, an EPC. You're more likely to live in a house that has an EPC, which is an F or a G, F or G rating. So because you're in poverty in the first place and then more likely to live in a house which has poor energy efficiency, you're then at an increased chance of being unable to adequately heat your home. And people living in those houses are more likely to face a choice between eating and heating. So those choices and the inability to heat the home to an adequate level means that people living in those houses are more at risk of physical and mental illness, which increases costs to the health service from those people with particularly with a respiratory related illness having to go and see their doctors. For the children living in those houses, they're more likely to miss days of school due to illness, which inevitably impacts upon educational attainment. For the parents of those children, they're more likely to miss days of work, either looking after their own kids because their kids are ill, or because they've been made ill by the poor quality of housing directly themselves. So this impacts upon the productivity of the workforce, increases costs for the health service, and potentially increases cost to benefit as well. And the current situation exists is that there's this pernicious cycle where because people are missing days of work because they're ill because of their house, so they then have less income, particularly if they're on insecure contracts, they have less income to then be able to adequately heat their house in the first place. There's this vicious circle that currently exists. So how can action on climate change help? Well, by improving the energy efficiency of our housing stock, so we can help to tackle and take away some of this relationship between poverty and poor housing quality. So we then can increase the chance of people being able to adequately heat their home. So they're at reduced risk of physical and mental illness. So we reduce costs for the health service. We reduce the number of days that children miss due to illness, which hopefully means that their educational attainment is better. We reduce the number of days that parents are forced to miss for being made ill themselves or for having to look after their children. We improve the productivity of the workforce. We reduce costs for NHS expenditure, and we reduce benefit payments. And we help to tackle some of this pernicious cycle that exists at the moment with poverty feeding directly into an inability to heat our homes adequately. And at the same time, those improvements in energy efficiency create jobs across the whole of the UK, reduce unemployment, and upskill the workforce simultaneously. And I'd like to give a couple of really nice examples that have taken action on this area in practice. The first is from Islington Council, who set up a project called Shine, and it runs on a concept called Boilers on Prescription. So it's a partnership where the housing team of the council have teamed up with local doctors, local GPs, and in this case, where particularly elderly members of the community are going to see their doctor for particularly respiratory related illnesses, with the permission of that patient, their details are passed on to the council. The council then gets in contact with that person and goes and does an audit of their house to identify where improvements can be made in energy efficiency. And then they contact one of the big energy suppliers to identify sources of funding for those vulnerable members of the community to make improvements into the energy efficiency through better insulation in the roof, through improving windows to make sure they're not drafty, not leaky, and so on. And so what this project is doing, it's really helping to address the root cause of a health-related problem, rather than what's currently happens at the moment in most places, where doctors deal with the symptoms of an illness and then send their patients back to the very home that had made them ill in the first place. And there's a really nice example from New Zealand where, having run a household energy efficiency program, they then tracked the children living in those houses over the following winter to see what impact it had upon the number of days of school that they missed. And they found that thanks to these improvements in energy efficiency, the students and the children living in those houses missed 21% fewer days of school the following year. So a really nice example about how this practical energy efficiency measure had a direct impact upon the opportunities for children to go to school and the associated benefits for their educational attainment. I'd like to give another example now of the kind of co-benefits of climate action, this case linking in with air pollution. So in the UK at the moment, there's around 40,000 deaths a year in the UK due to poor air quality, so particularly from particulate matter and nitrous oxides. And so if we take London, for example, around 70% of those deaths and 70% of the pollution levels in London are attributable to pollution from transport in particular. And there's at the moment a direct link between levels of social deprivation and higher levels of air pollution as well. In many cases, these are communities who haven't been responsible for producing the pollution, but are finding themselves exposed to other people's air pollution, which is deeply unjust. So colleagues at Imperial did some work on an international study which looked through all the literature to draw out the impacts that poor air quality had had upon different parts of the body. Their take-home message was that every single organ of the body is negatively affected by poor air quality, from your brain in terms of increasing in the chance of having a stroke, to dementia, to Parkinson's, to heart disease, to lung disease, to various different forms of cancer, to obesity, to even down to things like acne and skin allergies. So every organ of the body being negatively affected by poor air quality. So if we think in a similar way to the previous example about how this how this poor air quality and how the transport aspect of stuff links in and what impact it has. So at the moment in the UK, transport contributes to high levels of nitrous oxide and particulate matter, particularly in urban areas. There's around 40,000 deaths a year due to this poor air quality, linked to a high number of a range of illnesses, as shown in the previous slide. We know this increased cost for the health service associated with dealing with respiratory related illnesses. Poor communities are more exposed to air pollution, so in terms of the link in with poverty. Because of poorer communities are more exposed, so kids from poorer communities are more likely to miss days of school due to illness associated with poor air quality, which inevitably impacts upon their educational attainment. Similar way to the last example, the parents are more likely to miss days of work for looking after their kids and also for being ill themselves. The poor air quality and the impact on work impacts upon the productivity of the UK workforce, and it's estimated that premature deaths in the UK associated with poor air quality costs the UK economy around £54 billion a year. So how does action on climate change fit in? Well, one of the things that can be done is moving towards more electric vehicles. Others are improving the availability of active transport, so more options for members of the public to cycle and walk more, and of course better public transport as well. So by improving these various options through electrification of vehicles and improving public transport and active transport, so we can reduce levels of air pollution, particularly in urban areas, reduce the number of deaths a year due to air pollution, reduce costs for the health service, reduce the exposure of poorer communities to these levels of air pollution, meaning that the kids of those communities miss fewer days of school, their educational attainment is improved, parents miss fewer days of work, lower impact upon productivity, lower cost to the economy as well. And in this case, there are side benefits associated with that through the role that electric vehicles can play in helping to balance the grid as well, as they kind of exist as mobile storage devices for energy, so they can be storing up renewable energy when it's sunny and windy, and then putting that energy back into the grid when it's less sunny and windy. And then, of course, in this case, you've also got other benefits associated to public health through greater activity in more cycling and more walking, being both good for reducing emissions of carbon dioxide and particulate matter from the exhaust of vehicles, but then by people actually being cycling and walking and being more active, so that has a positive benefit directly upon their health as well. So I'll just go through a few different kind of practical things that need to happen now in some of the different areas of the economy, and touch on briefly how they relate to the co-benefits of climate action. So in the area of buildings, we know we need to be improving the energy efficiency standards of existing housing, but also of new builds, to make sure that we're not building houses that we're going to have to retrofit in 10, 20 years time. We should absolutely, and we can absolutely, be building houses to a really, really high standard, so they use minimal amounts of electricity, so they have a micro generation built into them. So in the image here, you've got this housing development with all the houses having solar panels on their roofs, for example. We need to be incorporating green space into our urban environments, so planting more trees, which have positive benefits both for things like air quality in many cases, and also for resilience to extreme weather events. We need to be, when we're building new houses and indeed retrofitting old houses, be making sure that we are integrating public transport and active transport links into those new developments, so the easiest option is the greenest option. As far as transport goes, we need to be providing affordable and safe public transport and active transport. We need to be rolling out electric vehicle charging, so that we can help to get over anxiety that can sometimes exist around the range that electric vehicles have, people being worried of running out of electricity and not having a charging station nearby. So we need to massively scale up the availability of these charging stations, and we need to, in urban areas particularly, we need to be moving our taxi fleets and our bus fleets towards electric or hydrogen alternatives, which also improve air quality while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of our urban areas in particular, we need to be incorporating more blue and green space into those areas. So and by green space, I mean more trees, more shrubs, more greenery. And by blue space, I mean more areas of water, more ponds, more rivers, streams, and so on. So blue and green infrastructure has been shown to have a real positive benefit in terms of helping to regulate temperature. So in the summer months, providing greater shade, reducing the urban heat island effect. In the winter months, actually helping to trap heat in. There's been studies that have shown reduced energy costs in the winter months for heating, where buildings have been closer to trees because they help to regulate the temperature to mean that it's less cold in winter and it's less warm in summer, providing a more comfortable urban environment. Of course, integrating blue and green space into our cities and towns is also really good for reducing the risk of flood as well. And in the last couple of months, we've seen significant flood events within the UK. Increasing green space can also improve biodiversity, improve air quality, particularly where it's planted in areas to help to act as a barrier to pollution from roads. And the provision of green spaces in urban areas has also been shown to have real significant benefits for mental health as well. There's many multiple benefits that we can have from taking action on climate change. So the planting of those trees in this case is, as they grow, they'll be drawing down carbon dioxide. Will also be providing simultaneous benefits for physical and mental health as well. So I'll finish off the co-benefits section of the presentation before going through a final few slides. What I hope I've shown over the last 10 minutes or so is that there are significant co-benefits of climate action for other strategic priorities, particularly around improving health outcomes via improving energy efficiency, improving the quality of housing, while also simultaneously attacking or targeting inequality as well, to make sure that we're providing a fairer society while we're taking action on climate change. These ideas around co-benefits, they need to be better incorporated into the decision-making process. As well as being something to incorporate into decision-making, I think the ideas around co-benefits can also be really powerful in how we talk about climate change to the public, because they help to bring in other issues that the public are most concerned about. We can talk about climate change in a way which brings in the NHS. We know that's something that the majority of the public are really worried about and want to help to protect and enhance as well. So I suppose the wider context in the UK at the moment is that around 2/3 of councils across the country have declared climate emergencies. So they set really quite ambitious targets for achieving carbon neutrality. And so local authorities and cities offer a really good opportunity because they know how these different issues, how housing, how poverty, how climate action can all link together on a local basis. And so we think that local authorities are a really key group of society to be acting on climate change at the moment. And ultimately, this is all about how we can make our lives better while simultaneously tackling climate change, particularly make our lives better through improving our health while taking action on climate change. So that's the kind of co-benefits part of the presentation. And what I'd like to finish on now is a final few slides relating to a publication that we put together. So at the Grantham Institute, we often get approached by members of the public saying, okay, yeah, we get the science of climate change. We understand it's a really important issue, but what can I do about it in my day-to-day lives? So what we did is we spoke to our scientists and put together this document called 9 Things You Can Do About Climate Change, with a list of suggestions of things that we can all do in our day-to-day lives. And I'll go through them now to finish off the presentation. The first thing we suggest is make your voice heard by those in power. So this is letting your local council, let your local MP know that you value action on climate change as being something to help to provide them with that knowledge that the mandate is there for them to go further and faster on action on climate change because you're supportive of it as one of their constituents. Moving towards a lower meat diet is one of the things that many of us can do in our day-to-day lives to reduce our impact, particularly beef and lamb and dairy as being the worst kind of sources of greenhouse gas emissions from our diets. So beef and lamb in particular, because those animals are ruminant animals, so they have a multi-chambered stomach. And they produce a lot of methane, a lot more than other animals do because they're ruminant animals. And methane is about 28 times worse as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So reducing, not necessarily going vegan, not necessarily going vegetarian, but making practical changes to your diet to reduce the overall amount of meat that you're consuming. That is a really good step to do to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, and also in many cases to actually have a slightly healthier diet as well. Cut back on flying is often the single biggest thing that many of us can do if we're taking a lot of flights a year. So look towards holidaying more in the UK or the near continent via the train where possible. Leaving the car at home, so using public transport more, or using active transport, cycling and walking more where possible. At home, taking action where you can to reduce energy consumption, which is obviously also good for reducing energy bills as well and saving money. Respecting and protecting green spaces. So if you have a garden, planting, growing food from your garden to reduce the food miles that the food that you eat has, and doing things like planting trees where you're able to. And that can also obviously be done in the workplace environment as well as at home. Investing your money wisely, so checking where your pension is being invested and if it's being invested in things you're not happy with. So for example, in fossil fuel companies or in other things, so maybe tobacco companies, let your pension provider know that you think they can be doing better and you want them to invest your money in something which is contributing to a future that you want your family to live in a future that's sustainable. Reducing consumption and reducing waste. So we do live in a society, as shown in this image here, which is somewhat throwaway, and particularly in things like fast fashion, where clothes are just made to be worn a handful of times and then thrown away. So trying to reduce the amount that you consume, and reduce particularly the amount that you waste as well, which is obviously also good for saving money. And lastly, one of the most important things you can do is talk about the changes that you make. So whether that's the changes you've made to your diet, for example, or trying to use the car less, it's really important to talk to people about that so they consider making those changes as well themselves. And so you can have frank and open conversations about some of the challenges that you've experienced while trying to reduce your impact on the environment. These things aren't always easy, and it's really important to recognize where those barriers exist and share ideas with others about things that you've encountered and how you've managed to overcome them as well, so that other people can help to overcome those challenges in a similar way, and indeed so you can learn from them about the ways in which they've made changes too. So that's it from me. Really great again to have been able to take part remotely in the London Climate Change Festival. Many thanks again for all the organisers who've put in a huge amount of effort. Sorry that it wasn't able to take place in person, but thank you very much to all the organisers. My contact details are there should you wish to get in contact, and I look forward to seeing the presentations from the other speakers.